In World War I, almost 9 million men were mobilized with the British Empire. There were 3,190,000 total casualties, which was 35% of the soldiers. Approximately 65 million men took part in the First World War. Out of these, there were 37 million casualties, approximately 57.5%. On top of this, over 8 million horses and mules died on all sides of the war. Another 2.5 million were treated in veterinary hospitals. Approximately 50,000 dogs were employed during the war, and 100,000 pigeons were used as messengers. On top of these animals, even camels and elephants were used during the war to help with the transportation of food, weapons, and to take over the jobs of the newly employed war horses. While the numbers of men who fought in the World War was staggering, we can't forget the loyal animals who fought alongside the soldiers for those long, hard years. To acquire the horses needed for the British Army, men went out across Britain buying horses left, right, and center during the first 12 days of the war. After these 12 days, the military had acquired 165,000 horses. Along with these horses, the Army also turned to North America for support, and soon horses came from Canada and the United States, and they made up 1/3 of those used by the British Army. The British cavalry attempted to fight on horseback in the very beginning of the war. They were wiped out by German machine guns and realized that trench warfare had put an end to this simpler kind of battle. Horses and mules then became of use transporting weapons, artillery, and even wounded men throughout the countryside. They would trek through muddy terrain better than any vehicle and supply heavy weapons to the front efficiently. 8 million horses and mules lost their lives during World War I, and another 2.5 million were treated in veterinary hospitals. In any war, communication is vital. In World War I, pigeons were used to send messages between the front lines and the bases. Pigeons may seem like an odd choice of communication, but they had a homing ability that made them especially useful. They were trained to fly to bases, and even if these bases were moved, they could still find their way back. When telephone lines were disrupted, or when the men had retreated or advanced past their communication lines, coded messages would be attached to a pigeon's leg and it would be released. The enemy lines tried shooting at these birds to prevent the messages from getting through, and when they realized that task was next to impossible, they brought predator birds, such as hawks, to the front line. Pigeons proved to be a very useful means of communication during the First World War, and their service was extended into World War II. About 100,000 pigeons were used during the First World War by the British, and they had an astonishing success rate of 95%. Dogs in the First World War had many different jobs. Their main jobs included warning the soldiers of the enemy, coming to the aid of wounded soldiers, and carrying messages. Scout dogs would patrol the terrain ahead of soldiers. They could detect enemy scents from up to 1,000 yards away. These dogs wouldn't bark when they detected the scents because it would draw attention to themselves, but instead they would perform a subtler movement, like raising their tail. Casualty dogs were trained to find the wounded, dying soldiers on the battlefield. The dogs were equipped with first aid supplies. Some soldiers could tend themselves, while others waited with the dogs until more help could arrive. Messenger dogs were used in place of human messengers because they were smaller and much faster. Dogs could easily run through any type of terrain, were a smaller target, and were very reliable if they were trained. The British alone employed 20,000 to 30,000 dogs during the war. Out of the many jobs that animals had during the war, one very important one was to simply keep the soldiers company. Some soldiers would keep pets with them. Dogs and cats were the most popular. Cats also helped to keep the mice population down in the trenches. Many battalions had mascot animals, such as cats, dogs, lions, birds, goats, bears, and many others. One famous mascot from World War I was a black bear cub from Winnipeg, Manitoba, who traveled overseas to Europe. When he arrived, the bear, Winnie, was placed in the London Zoo to shelter him from the cruelty of the front lines. It was here, in the zoo, that the bear became the inspiration for Winnie the Pooh. World War I was a long, strenuous war, and the outcome could have been drastically different if it weren't for the millions of loyal, hard-working animals.